The following is the Part 5 finale of a deep dive into the history of our Forgotten Realms, detailing the very first cosmic spark upon a lifeless world to the modern-day 5th edition of Faerûn. If you missed any or all of the previous 4 parts, I have links to each pinned in the comments below, and by popular request, a single supercut, including all 5 parts, will be available shortly after this Part 5. And depending upon when you are viewing this, it might actually be available right now. We have covered everything from the creation of life to the curse and exile of an entire people, and just about every major historical marker in between. But today, we end this series not in the ancient past, but the modern era encompassing the controversial lore of the 4th and 5th edition. From the witness of gods walking among mortals to a forever lost century, it all begins in 1358 Del Reckoning, a period best known as the Era of Upheaval. The Era of Upheaval is a fitting official name for this period of change lasting just over 120 years, stretching from 1358 into the 1480s. For many scholars and lore masters, however, this was an era of revision, so called for its generous use of some of the most historic changes seen across large swaths of Forgotten Realms history. The most devastating of the era's calamities would spring from a retcon storm of blue fire. But we must start the chronicles of this era 27 years before that infamous Spellplague would sweep across Faerûn. It was the Year of Shadows, 1358, better known as the Time of Troubles, a period when the divine rules of reality were bent and even gods found themselves vulnerable. The turmoil to follow officially started when the evil gods Bane and Merkel attempted to steal the Tablets of Fate, celestial artifacts believed to control the house rules of existence. Naturally, the overgod Ao was not amused. The result? A divine eviction from the pantheons of Realmslore. Nearly all gods were cast down from their planes, forced to walk Toril in mortal avatar form. Clerics discovered that divine magic only worked if you were within shouting distance of your deity, and the arcane arts were about as predictable as a drunk wizard juggling fireballs. This was the Godswar. Deities who were once abstract concepts of divine power were now getting into bar fights and being shanked in back alleys. Only Helm, god of vigilance and discipline, was exempt from this punishment, retaining his divine stature to stand sentinel at the gates of the heavens, barring entry until the Tablets of Fate were restored. The first victim of this punishment was Mystra, because of course it was. Desperate to return to the heavens and restore order, she tried to bypass the Overgod's mandate by ascending the celestial stairway without permission. Helm, bound by duty and decree, stood in her way. Mystra insisted, then resisted, but the goddess of magic in her greatly diminished avatar form was no match for Helm as the only deity to retain his full power. Mystra died instantly. By the way, that's number 2 if you're counting. Her death unleashed a torrent of arcane instability, only the first omen of the coming disasters. It would be the action of mortal heroes, some eventually granted their own godhood, who would retrieve the stolen Tablets of Fate. However, in a plot twist worthy of a David Fincher film, the Overgod destroyed the recovered tablets, untethering the realms from the rules that had once governed divinity, fate, and the world itself. With cosmic law unraveled and gods in mortal avatar forms dropping like flies, their domain portfolios became twisted or fading out altogether. The dead 3 of Baal, Bane, and Merkel in particular would each fall during this era. Baal, god of murder, was ironically murdered himself by the sword Godsbane at the hands of a mortal named Cyric. Baal is said to have foreseen his death, leaving behind a legacy of his mortal children known as the Baalspawn. Their stories are most notably recounted in the Baldur's Gate saga of novels and video games. The god of tyranny Bane and Torm, the god of duty, would kill each other in battle, while Merkel fell to the mortal wizard Midnight on the water-deep rooftops of Blackstaff Tower. When the dust finally settled, a handful of mortals scored themselves their own deific upgrades. Among them, the wizard Midnight, ascending to become Mystra, 3.0 if you're keeping score at home, as well as the quite insane mercenary Cyric, his divine appointment reflecting in the light of chaos to come, seeming about as wise as electing a pyromaniac to run a scroll shop. As the Time of Troubles came to a close, the gods were allowed to claw their way back to their thrones. However, the chaos was just warming up. The true shattering of Realmslore would come in the form of that mighty storm of blue fire. Let's make one thing clear. There is no archdevil, demon lord, or elder evil across the multiverse that has ever managed to kill as many gods or erase as many lands and their people as the 4th edition's rewriting of Realmslore, delivered in a historical disaster that would forever be called the Spellplague. With divinity restored to a pantheon of gods who seem to learn nothing from their Godswar punishment, the 4th edition specific lore of the Spellplague would tell us the calamity was ignited through the collusion of Cyric, always a willing vessel for chaos and now holding the status of a deity, and the Dark Lady of Loss, Shar. Manipulated by the Nightbringer Shar in 1385, Cyric the Mad God would murder who else but, say it with me, Mystra, and that makes 3. The death of the goddess of magic once again disrupted the weave. However, unlike the demise of her previous incarnations, this time the foundation of magic didn't just bend, it broke. The Spellplague, a dimension-warping hurricane of raw, blue, chaotic energy, was unleashed, and the fallout was apocalyptic. With the Tablets of Fate now broken, the distinct realities of Abir and Toril, separated over 32 millennia ago, began to blur as walls of surreal azure flame scoured land and sea, mutating everything it touched. I am barely scratching the surface of the many impacts of and scars left by the Spellplague, an event that I have well chronicled in a separate video called The 10 Sins of the Spellplague that you can check out in the links below. Regardless, in the Spellplague's aftermath, a residual plague would infect the realm for the next decade. They were called the Wailing or Plague Years, and they would be marked by a series of widespread transformations not seen since the planet's formation. The world's landscape was reshaped as entire regions, their empires, their people, even their gods, were destroyed, mutated, displaced, or simply vanished. The casualties were numerous. In the west, the remote island nation of Nimbral, known by sailors as the Sea Haven and the Land of Summer Seas, simply disappeared. Across the trackless sea to the west, the entire subcontinent of Mastika was ripped from the realms, Sid transported to Abir, its absence marked by the sudden arrival of the unfamiliar continent of Larrakond. Elsewhere, Chult was transformed from a peninsula into an island, forcibly isolated from the mainland as the terrain reshaped overnight. The eastern lands fared no better. The vast plain of the Shar collapsed in on itself, creating the Underchasm linking the surface world directly to the Underdark. The ancient empires of Aglarond, Unthar, Mulhorand, and Kondath saw the Spellplague destruction at their borders firsthand, with Mulhorand and Unthar vanishing almost entirely from Toril, their people scattered or lost. Haurua, a once mighty nation of archwizards, was nearly obliterated as they attempted to transport the nation elsewhere, but the devastation was near total, and Haurua disappeared from the realms. Lurin, the halfling homeland of the Shining South, drowned under the floods of an expanded Great Sea. Even the elven refuge of Evermeet was not immune to the blue storm of retcon, as portions of the island shifted into the Feywild, becoming unreachable to most mortals. The Spellplague did not discriminate in its destruction or its caprice, and in its aftermath, Faerûn was a world fundamentally changed. For the next century, scholars and cartographers grappled with a realm map that closer resembled a child's drawing than any historical record. And it would be in 1482 Dale Reckoning that the overgod Ao, reflecting on the erosion of normalcy caused by the 4th edition Spellplague, would then decide to step in and try to undo or repair at least some of the damage and residual scars left by the lore-rebooting Blue Storm. This attempt at a divine do-over would be called the Second Sundering and was only partially successful. Having destroyed the original Tablets of Fate during the Time of Troubles, an act intended to teach the gods humility but undeniably creating more chaos than order, Ao finally recognized that his dramatic gesture had fundamentally weakened the cosmological and natural laws of realm space. The destruction of these celestial bylaws had allowed the twin worlds of Abir and Toril, separated since primordial times, to slowly overlap and merge. Ao's solution was characteristically direct. Recreate the Tablets of Fate entirely, inscribe new divine portfolios and limitations upon them, and forcibly separate Abir and Toril once more. Yet, what makes this cosmic reset particularly fascinating and also quite maddening is its connection to events spanning the deepest reaches of Realmslore history. The Second Sundering appearing to present as not only the correction but a culmination of temporal echoes that rippled both backward and forward through the timelines of history. The most perplexing connection lies with the always confusing First Sundering, occurring circa -17,600. During that chronicled high magic ritual, this theory posits that the immense power brought forth not only created the island sanctuary of Evermeet, but literally bent time in the process, a rare feat that sent chronological shockwaves throughout the historic timeline. According to recovered text, an elven seer named Eliandrith of Orishar was present during this ritual, and in the throes of such temporal displacement, witnessed not only his own time's fracture, but also two other, quote, sunderings, one in the distant past and another in the far future. In what can only be described as prophetic, Eliandrith dubbed these visions the Tearfall, and the very event we are discussing now, the Second Sundering. These documented writings go on to suggest that the elven ritual of -17,600 created a temporal resonance connecting all three events. The Second Sundering's most dramatic manifestations, able to bear witness to mortal eyes, were the reversal of the Spellplague's geographic devastation. The Sea of Fallen Stars returned to its pre-Spellplague volume through a phenomenon known as the Great Rain. The Underchasm, a massive fragment of the planet that had connected the surface directly to the Underdark, was filled in completely, restoring the land known as the Shar to something resembling its former state. Most remarkable was the reappearance of entire nations that had disappeared during the Spellplague. Lanton and Nimbrel, both island nations that had vanished entirely, reappeared, with fantastic tales of ships from Nimbrel arriving at ports across the Sword Coast in 1483, their crews neither aged nor aware they had been missing from the world for nearly a century. Untha returned as well, though in a more diminished form and unable to reclaim all its former territories. And the waters partially receded from Loren, making the halfling homeland accessible again. Even more mysteriously, Evermeet was also restored to Toril, but in a state that defies conventional understanding of planar boundaries, with the Elven Islands simultaneously touching Toril, the Feywild, and Arvindor, seemingly existing across all three planes at once. The Faerûnian pantheon underwent equally dramatic changes during the Second Sundering, with what can only be described as a mass resurrection of previously dead or missing deities. The most significant of these divine restorations was that of Mystra, marking her third death and fourth rebirth. Meanwhile, the dead three, Bane, Baal, and Merkel, were resurrected, but found themselves greatly reduced in power as demigod divine mortals. This suggests that, at least for some, divine resurrection came with new terms of service under Ao's divine mandate. Perhaps the aspect of the Second Sundering found both most amusing and perhaps infuriating, at least from an academic perspective, was the quiet correction of cosmological models that had emerged during the Century of Upheaval, if these frameworks ever even changed at all. Sages studying the post-Sundering cosmos came to the conclusion that the Great Wheel cosmology was the proper model of the planes, dismissing alternative theories as the work of the lunatic fringe. The world access model, as well as concepts such as the astral sea, were relegated to the status of interesting but fundamentally flawed academic exercises. As we arrive at present-day Dale Reckoning to look back, our attempt to reconcile these ages and their events feels rather like documenting a fever dream. Coherent in the moment, bewildering in retrospect, and more often than we'd like, contradicted by later events that claim to have always been true in the first place. Yet perhaps that's poetically fitting for a world where the fundamental laws of reality are subject to divine revision, where an overgod can quite literally rewrite the rules when previous decisions prove inconvenient, and where the very nature of causality seems, well, negotiable. As we close out this epic series covering over 36,000 years of timelines, discoveries, and realm-shaping events, perhaps the most fitting perspective comes from one who knows intimately the cost of divine ambition. During his trial for the murder of Mystra, the mad god Cyric once declared, quote, "If I can destroy the love of gods, then I can certainly fill the lives of Faerûn's mortals with strife and discord." How prophetic those words proved to be, for in the end, the greatest threats to the realms never came from villains, dragons, or the evils of undeath, but from those who would and could remake reality according to their own distorted visions, whether they wore a crown of a god or simply dreamed of doing so. If you made it through all 5 parts without casting astral projection, then congratulations. You now know more about Faerûn's history than most actual Forgotten Realms NPCs. But before we plane shift out, a massive thanks to the legendary lore masters who make this whole operation possible, my channel members and Patreon supporters. These deep dives take hundreds of hours to produce, so if you learned anything or just enjoyed the ride, maybe subscribe and hit that like button like it owes you some gold. And if you want to help small channels such as this, hype this video up in the comments. For access to HD art packs across all my lore videos, as well as world building resources, maybe check out my Patreon. Links are below. Thanks for watching or listening, and let's do it again real soon. Until then, take care, my friends.